Screeching laughter and a clatter of raised voices shattered the early evening calm as I stepped out onto my back porch. At first, I thought the ruckus might be a neighbor's impromptu celebration, but as I peered across my sprawling fields, my eyes widened in disbelief. A full-blown wedding party was taking over my farm. Tents were pitched haphazardly, tables groaned under the weight of lavish buffet spreads, and a live band played upbeat tunes near the barn, all without my permission. I could hardly process the scene as my heart pounded with a mix of anger and incredulity. There, in the center of it all, was none other than HOA Karen, radiating self-righteous authority as she directed the festivities like a maestro. Dressed in her signature power suit and clutching a clipboard as if it were a scepter, she had transformed my private land into her personal event space, convinced that hosting a wedding on my property would somehow elevate the community's standards. I had always tolerated her meddling from afar, knowing her obsession with uniformity bordered on the absurd, but this was a blatant violation. As I stood there, the image of my carefully cultivated pastures now overrun with wedding guests and garlands was too much to bear. And then, a spark of mischievous inspiration lit within me. I recalled the stories of my fiercely independent goats, animals I'd raised on my farm, not only for milk and companionship, but also as a natural, unruly security force. They were known to roam the fields freely and had a reputation for causing delightful chaos when provoked. In that moment, I decided that if Karen was going to commandeer my land for her wedding extravaganza without so much as a by your leave, then I was going to remind her exactly whose property it was. Today, my goats would become the unexpected guests of honor. I envisioned them trotting up to the buffet table, nudging plates, and sending a cascade of food, and maybe a few exclamations flying across the scene. It was bold, it was unruly, and it was perfectly legal. This was not just a personal vendetta. It was a statement that private property rights come first, no matter how fancy the invitation might be. The idea of unleashing my goats on an impromptu wedding banquet was as outrageous as it was irresistible. As the first hints of sunset painted the sky, I knew that Karen's carefully orchestrated event was about to meet a dose of unpredictable farm justice. And as the anticipation built, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this night would be remembered for the day the goats crashed the party and turned HOA Karen's grand plans into a chaotic, unforgettable spectacle. Cedar Hollow Farm sprawled across 150 acres on the edge of a sleepy rural community, a patch of land I inherited from my grandfather, who instilled in me a deep respect for the land and a fierce independence. My farm was a blend of tradition and modern innovation. Rows of crops, open pastures dotted with grazing animals, and a collection of animals that were as much family as they were functional. Among these were my goats, a rambunctious, spirited pack known for their stubborn independence and surprising charm. They had been my loyal companions through thick and thin, and over the years, they'd earned a reputation as the unofficial guardians of my property. In stark contrast to the wide-open freedom of my farm was the meticulously managed community of Cedar Hollow Estates. This gated neighborhood prided itself on immaculate lawns, identical houses painted in pastel hues, and an unwavering commitment to order, all overseen by the local Homeowners Association, HOA. The rules were strict. Every detail, from the trim on your hedges to the design of your front door, was dictated by a precise set of guidelines. And no one enforced these rules more zealously than Karen Miller, universally known as HOA Karen. Karen, in her early 50s, was a walking encyclopedia of community regulations. Always dressed in sharply pressed outfits and armed with a clipboard and smartphone, she patrolled Cedar Hollow Estates like a self-appointed guardian of perfection. Her piercing gaze spared nothing. Even the smallest deviation from the community's stringent standards was noted, documented, and often met with a swift penalty. Her influence was such that neighbors often whispered her name in equal parts admiration and dread. I had never been one to follow every arbitrary rule. Growing up on a farm taught me that life was meant to be lived with a little chaos and a lot of passion. My property was my canvas, a place where creativity, hard work, and a free spirit coexisted in beautiful disorder. I took pride in the independence that defined Cedar Hollow Farms. Whether I was tending to the crops, mending fences, or simply enjoying the sunset over open fields, I did things on my own terms. So when Karen Miller decided, without any permission, to host a massive wedding on my land, it struck a nerve. It wasn't just an invasion of my privacy. It was a brazen act of entitlement. She had invited 100 guests to celebrate what she claimed was a community bonding event, using my fields as her personal venue. The thought that my carefully maintained property would be hijacked for someone else's celebration was infuriating. The wedding setup was as ostentatious as it was unauthorized. Elegant tents were pitched across a once quiet field. Rows of chairs lined a makeshift altar, and a buffet table laden with gourmet fare was set up near the barn. Every detail was meticulously arranged to impress, except that it wasn't on my property by my design. It was Karen's latest attempt to impose her vision of order on a place that thrived on individual freedom. I tolerated Karen's meddling in the past, a trimmed hedge here, a misplaced decoration there. But this was a step too far. My farm was sacred to me, a living legacy of my family's toil and triumphs, and I wasn't about to let it be commandeered by someone who saw it merely as a backdrop for her own ambitions. It was time to reclaim my land. And in the back of my mind, I knew exactly what my loyal goats could do. These animals, with their curious eyes and unpredictable nature, were the perfect embodiment of the wild, untamed spirit of my property. They had a knack for causing delightful chaos when provoked, and today they were going to be the instruments of my rebellion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the unauthorized wedding took on an almost surreal quality. Twinkling fairy lights draped over elegant tents, soft music floated on the air, and laughter mingled with the clink of champagne glasses. Guests began to mingle, oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing on private property. Meanwhile, I sat in my study, a storm of emotions brewing inside me. I scrolled through the community forum and saw that Karen had even posted a glossy invitation to the event, an invitation I had never received. The indignity of it all set my resolve ablaze. I couldn't simply stand by and let my land be used without my consent. I had to act, and act decisively. I began by reviewing the security footage from earlier that evening. The cameras captured every detail: the arrival of the guests, the setup of the buffet table near the barn, and, most damning of all, Karen herself orchestrating the event with a smug satisfaction that made my blood boil. I decided that if Karen wanted to host her unauthorized wedding, she would get more than she bargained for. I hatched a plan that was as bold as it was unexpected. I would unleash my goats on the buffet table. These weren't just any goats. They were my well-trained, fiercely independent pack, known throughout Cedar Ridge for their unpredictable antics. I remembered all too well how, during one unplanned adventure, they'd once rampaged through a neighbor's yard, leaving behind a trail of chaos and laughter. That memory sparked a brilliant idea. I hurriedly gathered my goat keeper's kit and made my way to the barn. In the dim glow of lantern light, I rounded up the pack. I had trained them to respond to specific commands, and tonight, those commands would be unleashed in a way that would send a clear message. My land was not theirs to commandeer. I knew that the sight of these unruly creatures charging toward a table laden with gourmet food would create a spectacle that no one could ignore. Before proceeding, I double-checked the layout of the wedding area. The buffet table, set near a cluster of expensive floral arrangements and under a marquee tent, was the perfect target. I could envision the guests' shocked faces as the goats, driven by instinct and a taste for mischief, descended upon the spread. I also anticipated that Karen, in her obsessive quest for perfection, would be the first to notice the chaos, and that would be all the better. I prepared a few commands on my secure radio and positioned myself at a vantage point near the field's edge where I had a clear view of the entire setup. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. I could hear the faint hum of music and the soft murmur of guests conversing. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and inevitable, I pressed the button on my radio to release the command. In an instant, The silence was shattered by a series of barks and the rapid thudding of hooves. My goats, responding as if on cue, burst out from the barn and charged toward the buffet table with an unbridled frenzy. The scene that followed was surreal. Plates clattered, food flew through the air, and guests erupted in screams and laughter as the goats began nibbling, overturning, and generally wreaking havoc on the carefully arranged spread. Amidst the chaos, I captured every moment on my phone. Each video clip, each startled reaction, every piece of evidence that would soon be shared online. I knew that this was not just about disrupting an unauthorized wedding. It was about standing up against an overreaching enforcer who had taken my property for her own use. As I watched the pandemonium unfold, I felt a fierce satisfaction, knowing that the tables had finally turned. Karen, who had been overseeing the event with an air of smug superiority, was caught completely off guard. Her carefully managed plans unraveled before her eyes as she watched guests scramble to escape the goat invasion. I could see her in the security footage, her face a mask of horror and disbelief, her plans collapsing in a cascade of chaotic, comedic disaster. This act of rebellion was more than just a prank. It was a declaration that my land, and the freedom to use it as I saw fit, was inviolable. Karen's overreach had forced my hand, and I was determined to make sure she, and the HOA, learned that property rights were not negotiable. By the next morning, the uproar had spread far beyond the confines of my farm. Social media was ablaze with videos of the goat rampage and screenshots of the chaos that had ensued. Hashtags like #GoatGate, #property rights, and #NoMoreCurrent began trending among Cedar Ridge residents. Neighbors who had long suffered under the oppressive grip of the HOA suddenly found their voices. Messages poured in, some in support of my unorthodox method of protest, others in disbelief at the audacity of it all. Local news stations picked up the story, sending reporters to Cedar Ridge to cover the bizarre incident. It's not every day you see a pack of guard goats crash a wedding buffet. One news anchor quipped on air, his tone a mix of amusement and awe. Interviews with stunned guests revealed a mix of laughter and outrage. One guest, still wiping spilled hors d'oeuvres off his suit, declared, "I've never seen anything like it. It was chaos, pure, unadulterated chaos." Meanwhile, the footage of Karen's frantic attempts to regain control of the event spread rapidly, painting her as the overzealous enforcer who had finally met her match. Inside the HOA board, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Emergency meetings were called, and behind closed doors, board members clashed over how to respond to the unfolding scandal. Some defended Karen's actions, insisting that rules were rules, while others acknowledged that her behavior had crossed a line and undermined the very principles of private property and community respect. Leaked minutes from these meetings showed deep divisions. One board member was quoted saying, "We must respect the sanctity of individual property rights, even if it means rethinking long-standing protocols." The internal strife was palpable. It wasn't long before digital petitions calling for accountability and reform began to circulate among residents. I continued to update my online community with every detail. I posted live streams of the aftermath, shared behind-the-scenes footage of the security cameras capturing the goat invasion, and uploaded a detailed blog post outlining every moment of the incident. The digital evidence was undeniable, a well-coordinated act of rebellion against an unauthorized wedding and an egregious violation of my property rights. Supportive comments flooded in from across Cedar Ridge, with many residents praising my bold stand. "If one person can take a stand, imagine what we all can do," one post read, echoing the growing sentiment of collective empowerment. As the controversy reached a fever pitch, local law enforcement and community advocates began to step in. The police department issued a statement clarifying that while the incident was chaotic, it was ultimately a matter of private property rights, and any further actions would be handled according to state law. Community forums buzzed with debates about the balance between maintaining order and respecting individual freedoms, and the #hashtag property rights became a rallying cry. Karen, on the other hand, was growing increasingly isolated. Her social media posts, once confident and authoritative, turned desperate and defensive. In a series of frantic videos, she insisted that the wedding was for the benefit of the community and that my actions were an overreaction. However, every attempt to spin her narrative was met with a tidal wave of digital evidence and a chorus of voices demanding accountability. By the end of the week, the pressure on the HOA board had reached a breaking point. In a highly anticipated announcement, the board declared that a final public hearing would be held to address the incident and to decide on disciplinary action against those involved in the unauthorized use of private property. The news sent shockwaves throughout Cedar Ridge. Neighbors organized gatherings in local parks, distributing flyers and urging everyone to attend the hearing. Online petitions reached tens of thousands of signatures, and the digital dossier of the incident, meticulously compiled from security footage, social media posts, and eyewitness accounts, was hailed as irrefutable proof of the need for change. The final public hearing was scheduled for a crisp morning, and the entire community braced for what promised to be a defining moment in the battle for property rights and individual freedom. The stage was set. The unauthorized wedding, the goat rampage, and the explosive digital evidence had all converged to form a powerful mandate for reform. Every shared post, every hashtag, and every supportive comment reaffirmed one simple truth. Our community would no longer tolerate arbitrary enforcement of outdated rules, and we would defend our rights with every tool at our disposal. The decisive moment arrived on a cool, brisk morning at the Cedar Ridge Community Center, where the final public hearing was underway. The boardroom was packed with a diverse array of HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and Resolute residents, all gathered to witness the final vote that would decide the future of our neighborhood's enforcement policies. With a calm, yet commanding presence, Councilwoman Angela Rivera stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the hope and determination of a community that had had enough. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including security footage, eyewitness testimonials, and detailed logs of the unauthorized event, we have reached an inescapable conclusion, Councilwoman Rivera began, her voice resonant and authoritative. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Miller, who hosted a wedding on private property without permission, were not only a gross violation of individual rights, but were driven by personal bias and a blatant abuse of power. Our community's trust in the HOA's ability to enforce rules fairly has been shaken, and we must act decisively. A heavy silence fell over the room as Rivera continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all sanctions imposed as a result of this incident, and we will launch a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an egregious overreach. Furthermore, new guidelines will be established to protect the property rights of every resident in Cedar Ridge. Today's decision is not merely about reversing an unauthorized event. It is a resounding declaration that our community will stand for fairness, accountability, and the inalienable right to private property. Her words resonated deeply, and murmurs of agreement spread throughout the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate, known for his unyielding defense of individual rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice firm and impassioned. "No resident should ever be subjected to the tyranny of arbitrary rule enforcement. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that Cedar Ridge values innovation, independence, and the sanctity of private property above all else. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our rights is met with swift, decisive action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting everyone in a resolute call for change. Following his powerful address, a senior officer from the local fire department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert testimonies, and official reports that confirmed the legitimacy of my property and debunked every claim made by Karen Miller. The evidence was irrefutable. The unauthorized wedding was a flagrant intrusion into private property, and my subsequent actions to reclaim my land were both legal and necessary. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Rivera concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Ridge, a community where every resident's rights are respected and where public authority is exercised with integrity. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, no matter how self-righteous, can impose their will upon us without accountability. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the inalienable right to live freely on our own property." Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of our community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Ridge. The days of petty, arbitrary enforcement were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic vote, Cedar Ridge underwent a remarkable transformation. News of the rescinded sanctions and the sweeping reforms enacted by the HOA board spread like wildfire throughout local media and social networks, igniting impassioned debates about property rights, community governance, and the importance of individual freedom. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Ridge" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive actions taken to protect the rights of every homeowner. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOA, and #CommunityJustice trended widely, reinforcing our collective determination to stand against arbitrary rule enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and to envision a future free from oppressive oversight. Neighbors, who had long lived in fear of invasive inspections and punitive fines, now spoke openly about their right to manage their property in a manner that reflected their individuality and values. Our land is our legacy, and no one should have the power to dictate how we use it, one resident declared passionately at a bustling meeting. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Cedar Ridge would always defend the freedoms of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint would be meticulously scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary fines or invasive enforcement. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our renewed commitment to fairness and justice. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to empower residents further. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about property rights and to encourage active participation in shaping a more equitable governance model. When we stand together, our voices are powerful enough to dismantle even the most entrenched systems, a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring residents to unite and demand change. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to retaliate against HOA Karen's blatant abuse of power by unleashing my guard dogs on her unauthorized wedding buffet and reclaiming my property through bold, innovative means had not only restored my rights, but had ignited a movement that resonated throughout Cedar Ridge. Neighbors who had long suffered under the tyranny of arbitrary enforcement found their voices and shared their own stories of resistance. The digital evidence that exposed Karen's misdeeds became a beacon of hope and a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the freedom to live on one's own terms. Karen Miller, once the formidable enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community stands united for justice. Her influence waned as digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the necessity of reform and the dangers of unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Ridge, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the gentle glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches resonated with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate the victory of our rights over arbitrary interference, a victory for every homeowner in our community, Councilwoman Rivera proclaimed, her voice ringing with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our freedoms and to ensure that no one can abuse public power again. As each new day dawned over Cedar Ridge, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen Miller's unauthorized invasion of my land was met with my bold countermeasure, and how my guard dogs and relentless determination forced her to face the consequences, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed that private property and personal freedom were inviolable. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Ridge, truth, justice, and individual freedom would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Ridge would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for individual property were cherished above all else.